So one of the things that we survivors hear a lot is, well, why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you leave if it was really that bad? Why didn't you leave sooner? How could you put your kids through that? How could all of this happen? Why didn't you? Why? And the reason this happens is because of something called a trauma bond. I've talked about this several times before on the podcast. I'll make sure that I link to episodes down in the show description and in the show notes for you to dive in more. But I want to talk specifically about how a trauma bond impacts our relationship with our kids, how it impacts our relationships with ourselves, and how overall it impacts our motherhood. So before we do all of that, what is a trauma bond? Essentially, a trauma bond is a really strong connection that your brain has with the person that abused you. Another way of describing it is an actual addiction that your brain has to the abuser. Why does your brain create this? Why does this happen? Well, basically it craves consistency, and it also craves the high it gets from the honeymoon moments within the abusive relationship. Honeymoon moments are those positive moments, those good things that would happen that keep us around. For example, your abusive partner storms out, they hurt you, they yell at you, they call you names, but when they get home, they take you out to a big fancy dinner. When they get home, they bring you roses. They tell you that they love you. Maybe you have really good sex and it's comfy and it feels loving and it's safe and it's great. Those are the honeymoon moments. They're the reasons that we stay in the abusive relationship. And the reason this is so dangerous is because your brain becomes addicted to those highs and those lows. It's a high when it's good, and it's really low when it's bad. And when it gets high again, you know, when they bring you the flowers, when they tell you they love you, when they go to a therapy, when they say they're going to change, and then when they immediately switch, and then they call you names, and they get abusive again, you have that crash. So your brain gets addicted to the chemical dump inside of your brain, of all of the chemicals that get dumped into your brain and then immediately taken away. You go through this process enough and your brain literally creates an addiction with the abuser. It creates an addiction to those chemicals, to the highs and the lows, and it's going to do everything in its power to get you to go back in order to get more of those highs and those lows, more of those good, feel-good chemicals. Trauma bonds they're the reason that we don't leave, but they're also the reason that we go back. Because your brain's gonna say, oh my gosh, it was so good. The sex was so good, but he was so sweet. You probably just overreacted. If you would have listened, you knew he was mad. You knew he wasn't in a good mood when he came home from work. So if you just would have stayed quiet, if you just would have done this, if you just would have kept the kids quiet, if you just would have done a better job, if you just would have this. All of the reasons why you are the problem, because your brain is desperate to get you to go back. But what your brain conveniently leaves out is all of the negative things that happened, all of the abuse that happened. And so you are going over and falling into this place where you desperately want to be with the person that abused you, and you're like, but this makes no sense. He abused me. Didn't he? Wasn't it that bad? Yes, mama, it was that bad. Your brain right now is just going through withdrawal. It's going through the detox process. And it's going to take time before it finds equilibrium again. But with all of that being said, with that crash course, what on earth does this have to do with motherhood? One, this impacts our motherhood, especially if you're a single mom and you are dating. Because if your brain can't have the person it wants, it's going to find that person in anyone it can. This is why you will find women going from abuser to abuser to abuser to abuser. And guess what? I was that person. I was in the abusive relationship cycle from the time I was 12 years old until I was 23 years old. This was a continued cycle for over a decade. So none of this is set in judgment. But this is why you see that. Because the brain is so hooked on that. That is the normal. It wants the highs and the lows. It wants that toxicity. It wants that feeling that it gets when things are good. That it forgets the danger when things are bad. This obviously can affect us as moms because we can, one, even if we don't allow these men to meet our kids, or allow these people to meet our kids, we are then going to take that pain and pass it on to our kids. Because an abusive dynamic, even if they've never been around your kids, is going to affect your kids because it affects you. And you are the leader of the home. And so if you are in this trauma bonded state with somebody and your brain is constantly, feeding after that chemical dump and feeding after those abusive, toxic people, you are going to harm your kids in the process. No matter how hard you try to hide it, because you're not going to be able to show up for them. You're not going to feel connected with yourself. You're not going to notice when something is off. You're going to miss obvious signs of things because your brain is so fixated on getting that chemical hit. And the reason why I keep saying your brain is because I don't want you to use this against yourself. I don't want you to use this to beat yourself up. It is incredibly important for you to understand that this is not something that you did to hurt yourself on purpose. This is something that happened as a result to the brain damage your brain took through the trauma you experienced in the abusive relationship. Do not use this to beat yourself up any more than you already do. But another way that this affects our kids is that what our kids see in us is their normal. So if they see you in these patterned relationships with the highs and the lows, and you're constantly in these trauma bonded relationships, so your brain is wanting the chaos and the pain and everything that comes with that, you are going to pass that down to your kids, because now your kids are going to see that as normal. And your kids, when this is normal, being treated well is boring. When this is normal, a healthy relationship is boring. It's not exciting. There's no butterflies. There's none of that chemical hit. So your brain's like, no, we don't want this. We want something more exciting. We want the fighting, because if they're not fighting with me, they're not passionate. If they're not jealous, they don't love me. If they are not possessive, they're not protective. And that's a problem. We need to make sure that we redefine normal. And another thing to understand when it comes to trauma bonds is that our kids can get trauma bonded too. Our kids can get trauma bonded with a distant parent if they show up and they shower them with gifts and then they're gone. If they make promises to show up and they talk all these grandeur, exciting things and then they never do. Your kids experience trauma bonds when they are consistently pulled close and pushed away. It's that push and pull, the push and pull. And it's so confusing for their poor brains that they end up also getting into that addicted relationship, which is going to become their normal, which is what they're going to pursue in the future in friendships and relationships. So we need to understand what trauma bonds are. We have to also heal from our own trauma bonds and get very clear on that so we are able to support our kids when we notice this happening. So with all of that being said, there are 7 signs that you are experiencing a trauma bond. I'm going to be referring to these in the present tense as if you are actively in the relationship and you're experiencing it. But I know that most of my audience are people that have already gotten out. So this can also apply to you, because this can help you understand why your brain's doing what it's doing when you're back in that relationship. Number 1, there's a constant pattern of non-performance. Meaning that they have proven time and time again that they're not going to change, but they keep making promises. They keep saying that they're going to change, but they never do. They change for a minute, and then they don't. You want to believe down in your core that they will change, but really you know that they won't. Number 2, others are disturbed by what's going on and you're not. Other people are like, he shouldn't be talking to you that way. He shouldn't be touching you that way. It's not okay that he's possessive. It's not okay for those things. Other people are concerned for you and you're like, no, this is fine. This is normal. This is okay. This is a healthy relationship. You just don't understand. This is just our dynamic. You just don't get it. That's a sign of a trauma bond. If you can't see it, there's something going on where your brain is already beginning to block out those negative experiences. Number 3, you feel stuck because the other person is being destructive. You feel like you can't move forward. You can't do anything in life. You can't even leave because this person is your responsibility. It's your job to make sure that they don't hurt themselves or anyone else. You have kind of stepped into this mother caregiver role to make sure that they cause the least amount of damage possible. Number 4, not only are you trying to make them least destructive, the actual destruction is your problem. It becomes your responsibility. It's your job to clean up their mess. It is your job to call family members and apologize. It is your job to take the pain and not call them out and not hold them responsible. We feel like we are required to clean up after them. And we also want to make sure that we repair the damage because we don't want anyone to see how terrible they really are. We want to save face. We want to save their character. Number 5, you have repetitive damaging fights with this person. These fights go on and on and on. They're always the same fight repeated over and over again. No progress is ever made, but you continue to have this conversation because you truly believe that eventually it's going to change things. But the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over in hopes that it will bring a different result. Number 6, you feel physically unable to detach from them. You can't even fathom not having them in your life. Even if you want to leave, you feel like you can't. Because it feels like you're chopping off your right arm. You don't know how to function without it. Because your brain does not know how to live without this consistent chemical hit. Because this is normal now. This is a part of life now. This is what it is, and therefore, you can't leave. And lastly, you try to leave, but it causes you physical pain. You get out of the relationship, you try to leave, and you get sick. You get migraines. You feel pain in your chest. Your body aches all over because now your brain is going through these withdrawals. It wants to make sure that you feel bad enough that you go back so your brain gets more of that chemical hit. You genuinely feel like you are losing a part of yourself. So if you are feeling guilty leaving your abuser, this is why. When you're in an abusive relationship, your brain is permanently changed. And I say permanently to help you understand not that you can't live a fulfilling life, but I want you to understand what's at stake. Your brain has been altered. This doesn't mean that you're not capable of living in freedom. It doesn't mean you're not capable of happiness, but it does mean that you're going to have to learn how your brain works in order to make the accommodations needed to live the life that you want to live. It is so important for us to understand as survivors why we feel guilty so we don't go back. It's important for us to understand why we want to go back even though we know it was so bad. Because if we don't have that understanding, we will fall back into old patterns. And like I said before, this also applies to kids, not just romantic relationships. This can apply to an abusive mother or abusive father. This can apply to a teacher, a parent, a boss, a coworker. You know, we can even become trauma bonded with our kids if our kids have that relationship with us, or if our child is an addict or they're going through something, and so we're trying to appease our pain by trying to fix their pain, and we create this cycle. As moms, we have an extra responsibility to break these trauma bonds and heal from the trauma bonds, because if we don't, we will pass this down to our kids. And I know, for one, that I have gone through this and I have experienced so much physical pain that I do not want my child to go through with this. I don't want my child to go through this. I don't want him to ever have to feel this pain because I want to learn from it, so I break the cycle. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Understanding what a trauma bond is incredibly important, but it is not the only thing we have to do in order to begin to break these cycles, in order to truly say this ends with me. Now, breaking a trauma bond is huge. It is massive, and it is something to be celebrated. And yes, it is possible. I remember thinking, probably not even 3 years ago, that I would never ever not miss my abusive ex. And one day I woke up and I realized I didn't miss him anymore. And there was not enough money in the world or ease in the world that could be given to me that would ever make me go back. And that's when it hit me that the trauma bond was finally broken. I was finally free for the first time in my life. So I never want this to come off like this is easy, because I'm very much aware that it's not. But I want you to understand that it is possible. And it's going to be hard. It's going to be the hardest thing you have to do. But you also don't have to go this alone. This process took me so much longer than it should have because I didn't know what I was doing. And the support that I needed, the support for survivors in general is dismal. But when you're a survivor and a mom and you're wanting that specific support, it doesn't exist. It's not there. And so I had to try and fail so many different things before I found what worked. And so that's why I do what I do, and that's specifically why I created Cycle Breaker. This is a course that you can get through over the course of a weekend. You can probably bust it out in just a day, to where you will go through and you'll process through these things and then begin to take action. You can also slowly but surely do this over the course of a whole week, or maybe over the course of a month. If you watch one module and then implement, and then watch another module and then implement. This course was created by a busy mom for busy moms. So not one of the modules is longer than 15 minutes. I think the longest one is 13 minutes. The shortest one is 3, because I wanted to give you actionable tips with no fluff. This is a course that will literally change your life if you let it. It is not going to be easy. The work is hard. The course is fun, and I'm very proud of it, but it is hard work. And the course itself is going to teach you how. But if you don't implement, you're not actually going to see change. So if you are ready to commit to this, if you are ready to say, I am a cycle breaker, if you're ready to say, this ends with me, go grab Cycle Breaker. This mini course will literally change your life and your kids' lives in every single generation after. So if you're ready, don't wait.